when billionaire Walter Green left a $5 tip on a $73 breakfast bill at Morrison's Diner on a gray Tuesday morning in March, he expected the waitress to react exactly like the previous 11 had reacted over the previous 11 months, with barely concealed disappointment or thinly veiled resentment, or the particular kind of forced smile service workers use when customers are cheap and complaining won't change anything when they know the tip is insulting, but saying so would risk their job, so they just swallow the disrespect and move on to the next table hoping for better. What he didn't expect was for India Foster, the 46-year-old black woman who just refilled his coffee 3 times without being asked and remembered. He took it black with no sugar, even though he'd never been to this diner before. And she served dozens of customers every shift to pick up the $5 bill, look him directly in the eyes with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and recognition, and a wisdom that suggested she understood exactly what he was doing and had chosen her response anyway, and say 7 words that would completely rewrite the $9.4 billion will sitting in his lawyer's office waiting for him to decide who deserved his fortune and change both their lives in ways neither could possibly predict. This is enough. Thank you for seeing me. Walter Green was 68 years old and had spent the last 11 months conducting a test that had become equal parts social experiment and grief ritual, eating breakfast at different diners across Massachusetts and leaving exactly $5 as a tip regardless of the bill amount, watching how people reacted when given less than they deserved, measuring character by how gracefully someone could accept disappointment. He was worth $9.4 billion as founder of Green Pharmaceuticals, owned homes in 4 states, and art collections worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. But none of that wealth had been able to save his wife Margaret when cancer came for her 8 months ago after 43 years of marriage that had defined every good thing in his life and left him hollowed out and bitter when it ended. They'd never had children because Margaret couldn't, some medical complication from her 20s that had broken her heart, but she'd made peace with. While Walter had told himself it didn't matter, they had each other, and that was enough. Except now she was gone, and he had no children and no grandchildren and no one to leave his fortune to except distant relatives he'd never met, who'd probably fight over it like vultures or charities. He'd pick randomly, because what did it matter where money went when the only person who'd made that money meaningful was dead? So Walter had started testing people, looking for someone who could receive little with grace, because if someone could be grateful for $5, maybe they wouldn't be corrupted by 5 million. Maybe they'd be worthy of inheriting wealth that should have gone to children he'd never had. 11 diners, 11 waitresses, every single one had complained or shown visible disappointment or called him cheap under their breath loud enough for him to hear, or in one memorable case, thrown the $5 bill back at him and told him to keep it if he needed it that badly. Each reaction had confirmed what Walter already believed, that people were fundamentally greedy, that kindness was conditional on reward, that Margaret had been the exception to human nature. And now that she was gone, he was surrounded by people who only cared about what they could get from him, proving that his cynicism was justified and his loneliness was permanent, and there was no one left in the world worth trusting with anything that mattered. India Foster was waitress number 12, working the Tuesday morning shift at Morrison's Diner, where she'd worked for 3 years serving eggs and coffee and pancakes to regular customers who knew her name and travelers passing through who didn't, working double shifts whenever the diner would let her because her daughter Cadence was 19 and in college on a full scholarship for pre-med. But scholarships don't cover everything, don't cover textbooks and lab fees and the laptop that died sophomore year and had to be replaced and the 1,000 small expenses that pile up when you're trying to build a future from a starting point of nothing. India's husband had died 6 years ago in a construction accident, no life insurance because they'd been young and immortal and never imagined death could come for someone in their 30s, leaving India with a 13-year-old daughter and a grief so massive she'd had to compartmentalize it into a box she only opened at night because falling apart during the day wasn't an option. When falling apart meant your kid doesn't eat, she was exhausted in the particular way single mothers working multiple jobs are exhausted, bone-deep tired that sleep doesn't fix because sleep is interrupted by worry and planning, and the mental mathematics of stretching paychecks that never quite stretch far enough. But India had made a decision years ago, that bitterness was a luxury she couldn't afford, that becoming hard and resentful might protect her heart. But it would poison her daughter's childhood, so she chose kindness even when customers were rude, chose patience even when she was running on 4 hours of sleep, chose to believe that everyone she served was fighting battles she couldn't see, and deserved grace regardless of how they treated her, because judgment was heavy and she was already carrying enough. Walter's breakfast bill came to $73, which was high for a diner breakfast, but he'd ordered extra food deliberately, steak and eggs and pancakes and orange juice and coffee refilled 3 times, building the bill up so the $5 tip would be obviously insultingly inadequate, would be impossible to interpret as anything except cheap or cruel, forcing a reaction that would reveal character. Standard tip would have been $15 to $20, maybe more if someone was generous. Definitely not $5. Definitely not an amount that suggested either poverty or contempt. He'd dressed carefully for these tests, worn casual clothes that could belong to anyone, driven his 15-year-old Honda instead of any of the cars sitting in his garage worth more than most people's houses, left his expensive watch at home and wore a cheap Timex that looked like something a retired teacher might wear, wanting to look like a regular customer, maybe struggling financially. Certainly not like someone worth nearly $10 billion who was testing whether service workers could be grateful for insults. He paid the bill in cash, left the $5 tip folded under his empty coffee cup where India would find it after he left, then walked to his car in the parking lot and sat watching through the diner window, had done this 11 times before, watched waitresses pick up inadequate tips and watched their faces change from professional pleasantness to disappointment to anger. Watch them complain to coworkers or managers, or sometimes follow him to the parking lot to confront him about his cheapness, every reaction confirming what he already believed about human nature, and giving him permission to continue believing the world was exactly as dark as his grief had made it seem. India cleared his table 3 minutes later, stacked the dishes efficiently with the practiced motion of someone who'd done this thousands of times, picked up the $5 bill and paused, counting it once quickly, then looking around like maybe there was more money she'd missed, then looking at the check showing $73 and doing the mental math that didn't require much math, because $5 on 73 was obviously wrong, obviously either a mistake or an insult. Walter watched from his car, waiting for the familiar disappointment, the complaint, the confirmation that India Foster was no different from the previous 11, that kindness was performance and generosity was transactional and his test was working exactly as designed. Instead, India smiled. Actually smiled, genuine and warm despite the obviously inadequate tip, and said something Walter couldn't hear from the parking lot, but could read on her lips, could see in her body language that suggested gratitude instead of resentment, acceptance instead of anger. He sat stunned in his Honda for 30 seconds, trying to process what he'd just witnessed, then got out of the car and walked back into the diner, found India wiping down the table he'd just left, approached her with confusion written across his face that he couldn't hide behind the careful mask he usually wore. "Excuse me," he said, his voice uncertain. "Why did you say that? What did you say when you picked up the tip?" India turned to face him, the $5 bill still in her hand, her expression patient like she was explaining something obvious to someone who should already understand. "I said, 'This is enough. Thank you for seeing me,'" she answered simply, like those words required no explanation, like gratitude for $5 on a $73 bill was the most natural response in the world instead of the impossible reaction that had just shattered 11 months of carefully constructed cynicism. If you believe that how we respond to disappointment reveals more about us than how we respond to abundance, subscribe to Love is Kindness for stories about grace in unlikely places. Would you have said thank you for that $5 tip? Or would you have complained? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because somewhere right now someone is being tested by cruelty disguised as character assessment, and maybe they need to know that choosing kindness anyway isn't weakness. It's wisdom. Most people would be upset by that tip, Walter said, his confusion genuine because India's response had broken every pattern he'd spent 11 months establishing, had violated every prediction his cynicism had made about human nature, and left him standing in a diner trying to understand why someone would choose gratitude when resentment was not just justified but expected. India looked at him with patient eyes that suggested she'd been asked versions of this question before, by customers who didn't understand why she didn't match their rudeness with her own, why she refused to participate in the particular cruelty that service work often becomes when people forget that servers are human. "Why would I be upset?" she asked, genuine curiosity in her voice, like the answer was obvious, and she was waiting for him to see it. "You came in. You were kind. You said please and thank you every time I refilled your coffee. You looked at me when you spoke instead of at your phone. That matters more than money." "But it's objectively a bad tip for the service," Walter pressed, needing her to acknowledge the insult he'd deliberately crafted, needing confirmation that she understood he'd been cruel and had chosen grace anyway, instead of just being oblivious to the mathematics of tipping. India nodded slowly. "Maybe it is. But maybe you're having a hard month. Maybe that's all you could spare. Maybe you've got medical bills or car trouble or a family emergency eating every dollar you earn. I don't know your story. How can I judge your tip without knowing your circumstances?" "What if I'm just cheap?" Walter asked, testing her framework, pushing to see if her grace had limits or conditions hidden underneath the surface kindness. India smiled, the kind of smile that comes from years of dealing with difficult customers and choosing patience when anger would be easier. "Then that's your business, not mine. I can't control what you give. I can only control how I receive it. And I choose to receive it with gratitude because the alternative is bitterness, and bitterness is exhausting, and I'm already tired enough without adding that weight." She told him about her daughter then, about Cadence, who was 19 and in college on a full scholarship studying pre-med, about how proud India was and how terrified, because the scholarship covered tuition but not everything. Not the textbooks that cost hundreds of dollars, or the lab fees, or the laptop that had died and needed replacing, or the 1,000 expenses that schools don't mention when they offer financial aid. Told him about her husband who died 6 years ago in a construction accident, how one day he'd left for work and never came home, how the company had given her 2 weeks of his salary and called it generous, how there'd been no life insurance because they'd been young and immortal, and insurance seemed like something for other people, older people, people who'd had time to plan for mortality. India had worked 3 jobs that first year after her husband died, barely slept, barely functioned, moved through days like a ghost operating on autopilot because falling apart wasn't an option. When falling apart meant her 13-year-old daughter didn't eat, meant giving up when giving up would dishonor everything her husband had worked for, everything he'd believed about building a better future for their child. The tips were terrible sometimes, she explained, her voice carrying the memory of those dark months. People can be cruel when they think you're invisible, when they see servers as furniture that brings food instead of as humans with mortgages and children and grief. They're trying to survive while also trying to smile and ask if you want more coffee. But I decided, India continued, her voice gaining strength around a decision she'd clearly made deliberately and reinforced daily. I won't let other people's worst moments make me bitter. Because everyone's fighting battles I can't see. Everyone's carrying weight I don't know about. Maybe you needed that $68 more than I need to be offended by not getting it. Maybe being kind to you matters more than being paid fairly by you. I can't control your choices. I can only control mine. Walter's internal struggle was written across his face in ways he couldn't hide, 11 months of carefully constructed cynicism cracking under the weight of India's philosophy, every test he'd conducted suddenly feeling hollow and cruel instead of justified and illuminating. He'd been looking for someone worthy of his fortune, someone who could receive little with grace, because he'd convinced himself that gratitude in scarcity proved character in abundance. That if someone complained about $5, they'd be corrupted by 5 million. That testing people's reactions to disappointment would reveal their true nature and help him identify who deserved to inherit wealth he'd built with Margaret and now had no children to pass to. Every other waitress had complained, had proven his cynicism correct, had shown disappointment or resentment or anger that had allowed Walter to maintain his belief that people were fundamentally greedy, that kindness was transactional, that Margaret had been the exception, and now that she was gone, he was surrounded by people who only cared about what they could extract from him. But India's response had broken his entire framework, had assumed the best of him when he'd been deliberately cruel, had chosen grace when judgment was not just justified but expected, had treated him like a human struggling instead of like a customer being cheap, and that generosity of spirit was destroying every defense Walter had built around his grief. "What if I told you I could afford more?" Walter asked, his voice quiet, testing whether knowing he'd chosen cruelty instead of been forced into it would change her grace into judgment. "Much more." India met his eyes steadily. "Then I'd say that's between you and your conscience. Not my place to judge what you can afford or what you choose to do with it." "What if I told you this was a test?" Walter said, the confession coming out like something he'd been carrying too long and needed to release. India's face changed then, not to anger, but to something sadder, something that looked like disappointment mixed with understanding. "A test?" Walter nodded, the words tumbling out in a rush now that he'd started confessing. "I've been doing this for 11 months, 12 diners, 12 waitresses, eating expensive meals and leaving $5 tips regardless of the bill, watching how people react when they get less than they deserve. All of them complained, called me cheap. One threw the money back at me and told me to keep it if I needed it that badly. You're the first person who said thank you. The first person who assumed I might be struggling instead of assuming I was cruel. Why?" Tears formed in India's eyes, catching the fluorescent diner lights and making them glisten in ways that made Walter's chest tighten with guilt he hadn't felt in months of conducting these tests. "Because I remember what it's like when $5 is all you have," she said, her voice breaking slightly around memories that clearly still hurt despite 6 years of distance. "After my husband died, I lived on tips like that, sometimes worse. Sometimes people left nothing at all or left change that added up to less than $1 after I'd served them for an hour. I remember the days when $5 meant my daughter ate and I didn't, when I'd buy her dinner and tell her I'd already eaten when really I was just too broke to feed us both and too proud to let her know. I remember what it feels like when someone sees you as human instead of as a servant," India continued, wiping her eyes but letting the tears fall anyway, because hiding emotion took energy she'd learned to redirect toward surviving. "You said please. You said thank you every time I refilled your coffee. You looked at me when you spoke, instead of snapping your fingers or calling me waitress like some people do, like learning my name requires effort they can't be bothered to expend. Most people don't do that. Most people treat servers like furniture that talks, like we're not fully human, just part of the restaurant infrastructure that exists to meet their needs without having needs of our own. That kindness, that basic human recognition, is worth more than money. That's why I said thank you. Not because $5 was enough, but because you made me feel seen." Walter felt something crack in his chest, some wall he'd built around his grief to protect himself from more pain, hearing this woman explain that his deliberate cruelty had been received as kindness because he'd said please, because the bar for treating service workers like humans was so low that basic politeness felt like generosity. "My wife died 8 months ago," he said, the confession coming easier now that India had shared her own grief. "We were married 43 years. Met when I was 25 and she was 23. She was a nurse. I was nobody, just starting a pharmaceutical company in my garage with ideas and desperation and no guarantee any of it would work. We never had children," Walter continued, his voice carrying the old ache of that loss, even though decades had passed since they'd stopped trying. "Margaret couldn't. Some medical complication from when she was younger. We talked about adoption, but never did. Kept saying we had time, kept putting it off until suddenly we were in our 60s, and time was gone, and it felt too late to start parenting teenagers or even younger kids when we'd be elderly by the time they graduated high school. Now, I'm 68 years old with $9.4 billion and no one to leave it to. No children, no grandchildren, just distant relatives I've never met who'd probably fight over it like vultures, or charities I'd pick randomly, because what does it matter where money goes when the only person who made that money meaningful is dead? So I've been testing people," Walter admitted, shame creeping into his voice now that he was saying it out loud to someone who'd been on the receiving end of his test. looking for someone who isn't corrupted by money, someone who can receive little with grace. Because if you can be grateful for $5 when you deserve 15, maybe you won't be destroyed by 5 million when you deserve nothing. Maybe you'd be worthy of inheriting a fortune I built with my wife, and now have no one to pass to except lawyers and tax collectors and distant cousins who never called when Margaret was dying. I'm sorry about your wife, India said, and the sympathy in her voice was genuine, unpracticed, the kind of condolence that comes from someone who understands grief intimately, instead of someone offering empty platitudes, but testing people's character by being cruel to them. That's not revealing who they are, that's revealing who you are. Walter felt those words hit him like a physical blow, felt 11 months of justified experimentation reframe itself into something uglier, something that looked more like pain inflicting pain than wisdom seeking wisdom. What do you mean? He asked, though some part of him already knew. You've been hurt, India said gently, her voice carrying the particular kindness of people who understand that cruelty usually comes from wounds instead of evil. So you're hurting others to see if they'll stay kind anyway, testing whether people can maintain grace under mistreatment. But kindness isn't about accepting abuse, it's about choosing grace despite recognizing cruelty. I said thank you because that's who I choose to be, not because I didn't notice you were testing me, not because I'm naive enough to think $5 on 73 was appropriate. I said thank you because I decided years ago that my response to other people's worst moments wouldn't define me, that I'd be kind, regardless of whether kindness was returned or even deserved, because the alternative was becoming bitter, and bitterness was killing me faster than poverty ever could. Walter realized she was right, felt the truth of it settle into his bones in ways that made 11 months of testing suddenly look like exactly what India had named it. Not character assessment, but character revelation, not discovering who others were, but exposing who he'd become after Margaret died, someone who inflicted small cruelties and called it wisdom, who hurt service workers and called it research, who'd taken his grief and weaponized it against strangers to justify the cynicism that protected him from hoping anyone could be good enough to inherit what he and Margaret had built together. India hadn't passed his test because she was naive or desperate or blind to his cruelty. She'd passed because she'd chosen grace despite recognizing exactly what he was doing, had looked at his deliberate insult and decided to respond with humanity anyway, not because she was weak, but because she was strong enough to refuse participation in the particular darkness he'd been spreading for almost a year. Can I take you to dinner? Walter asked, the question coming out uncertain, vulnerable in ways billionaires rarely sound vulnerable. A real dinner, not as a test, as an apology. India studied his face, looking for sincerity or manipulation, or whatever it was that had made her skeptical of strangers bearing gifts after 6 years of surviving on tips that sometimes covered rent and sometimes didn't. Why? She asked simply. Because you're the first person in 11 months who treated me like a human instead of like a wallet, Walter said. Because you reminded me that my wife would be ashamed of who I've become, of the tests I've been conducting and the cruelty I've been calling research. Margaret believed in service. Spent her whole career as a nurse taking care of people who couldn't always pay, who sometimes were rude or demanding or ungrateful, and she did it anyway, because she said everyone deserved care regardless of whether they deserved it. You remind me of her, and I need to apologize for forgetting what she taught me. 1 week later, Walter took India to an upscale restaurant, the kind with cloth napkins and wine lists that required translation and prices that made working people uncomfortable. Not as another test, but as a genuine apology, as an attempt to begin repairing the damage 11 months of deliberate cruelty had done, not just to the 12 waitresses he'd tested, but to his own soul that had been corroding under cynicism he'd been calling wisdom. He told her his full story over dinner that stretched 3 hours, about Margaret, who'd been a nurse at Mass General when they met, about how she'd believed in service not as obligation, but as calling, about how she'd spent 43 years caring for people who sometimes couldn't pay, and sometimes were rude, and sometimes died despite her best efforts, and she'd done it anyway, because she said everyone deserved care regardless of whether they deserved it. Walter showed India his will, the one drafted 8 months ago in the immediate aftermath of Margaret's death, when grief had been so acute he couldn't think straight, could barely function beyond signing documents his lawyers put in front of him. The current will split his fortune between charities he'd chosen almost randomly, organizations with good reputations, but no personal connection, no meaning beyond being places to dump money, because he didn't care where it went. As long as his distant relatives who'd never called when Margaret was dying wouldn't get to fight over it, like vultures picking clean the carcass of everything he and Margaret had built together. India asked about Margaret, about who she'd been beyond nurse and wife, and Walter talked about her for the first time since her death with something other than crushing grief, talked about her laugh that was too loud for someone so small, about her terrible cooking that he'd pretended to love for 43 years, about how she'd worked night shifts so sick children wouldn't be alone in the dark, about her philosophy that service workers and healthcare workers and anyone who spent their lives taking care of others deserved respect above all else, because they held society together with underpaid labor and unrecognized sacrifice. "She would have loved you," Walter said, his voice breaking. "Would have said exactly what you said. Would have called me out for testing people instead of trusting them, for measuring character through cruelty instead of through conversation." "I want to rewrite my will," Walter said suddenly, the decision crystallizing as he spoke it out loud. India immediately shook her head. "I don't want your money," she said firmly, the same pride that had let her work 3 jobs instead of asking for help making her reflexively. It comes from being hired for expertise rather than being helped out of pity. She used her experience to identify who really needed help, could spot the difference between someone temporarily struggling and someone systemically trapped, could see past applications and tax returns to the humans, underneath asking for a chance to stand up instead of a handout to stay down. Walter funded it with $2 billion initially, enough to make real impact without depleting his fortune, enough to prove he was serious without being reckless, enough to help thousands of families immediately while building infrastructure that would last decades. The first year, they helped 3,000 families, paid off $47 million in medical debt that had been destroying credit and futures and hope, funded 500 college scholarships that covered not just tuition, but everything scholarships usually missed, the real costs that made education impossible for people who'd earned their place but couldn't afford their seat. India's approach was dignity, not charity. Her philosophy built from years of receiving help that sometimes felt like judgment, that came with conditions and oversight and the particular humiliation of having to prove you deserved assistance. "We don't give handouts," she told the foundation staff she hired, people who'd also lived paycheck to paycheck and understood what struggling families needed. "We give people what they need to stand up, not what makes donors feel good, not what looks impressive in annual reports, what actually changes lives in ways that last after our checks clear." India's daughter Cadence graduated medical school 4 years later, funded partly by the foundation scholarship program that India had designed specifically for students like her daughter, kids who'd earned their place through merit but needed support beyond tuition, kids whose parents worked multiple jobs but still couldn't quite cover the gap between scholarship and reality. Cadence became a doctor at a free clinic, choosing to serve communities that couldn't always pay instead of pursuing the lucrative specialties her classmates competed for, embodying the values both India and Margaret had lived even though they had never met. Walter attended Cadence's graduation, sitting beside India in the audience and crying through the ceremony with the particular emotion of someone who'd lost the chance to attend his own children's milestones and was being given this moment as unexpected grace. "Your mother changed my life," Walter told Cadence afterward at the reception, this young doctor who reminded him of everything Margaret had believed about service and sacrifice. Cadence smiled, the same patient wisdom her mother carried. "She changed mine too," Cadence said, "every day, still does." Walter's transformation was complete in ways he couldn't have predicted when he'd started testing waitresses 11 months earlier, no longer bitter or cynical or measuring. Character through cruelty disguised as assessment. He spent time at the foundation offices, met the families they helped, heard their stories about medical bills that had been crushing them and scholarships that had saved their children's futures, and the particular relief of being helped without being judged, without having to prove they deserved assistance, without the humiliation that usually accompanied poverty in America. He rediscovered purpose after Margaret's death, something to wake up for beyond managing wealth that had stopped meaning anything when the person who'd made that wealth meaningful died. Walter wrote a new will, this one with intention instead of resignation, leaving the bulk of his fortune to the foundation with India as trustee, ensuring the work would continue after his death, that his and Margaret's legacy would be measured in families helped and futures saved rather than in Forbes lists or company valuations or the particular emptiness of wealth accumulated without purpose. 2 years after that first $5 tip, Walter returned to Morrison's Diner with India, their weekly coffee tradition that had formed naturally over months of foundation planning and had become friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than on hierarchy or transaction. A different waitress served them, young woman, maybe 23, exhaustion carved into her face in ways Walter recognized now, the particular tiredness of people working multiple jobs and barely surviving despite doing everything society claimed would lead to stability. Walter's bill came to $68. He left a $100 tip, folded carefully where the waitress would find it, then waited while she cleared their table. The young woman picked up the money, counted it, looked around confused like maybe she'd misread the numbers or he'd made a mistake. "Sir?" she said, approaching their table with tears forming. "This is too much. You don't have to." Walter smiled, using India's exact words from 2 years earlier. "It's enough. Thank you for seeing me." India watched this exchange, watched Walter transform her philosophy into his action, watched him give not to test but to bless, not to measure but to multiply, not to reveal character but to recognize humanity. "You learned," she said quietly after the waitress left, still crying, clutching the tip like proof that kindness existed. Walter met India's eyes. The friendship between them settled and comfortable in ways that transcended the wealth gap that should have made them strangers. "You taught me," he said simply. 5 years after the $5 tip that had started everything, the foundation had helped over 50,000 families, paid off more than $500 million in medical debt that had been destroying lives and futures, funded thousands of scholarships that had sent kids to college who otherwise would have been trapped in the same poverty their parents couldn't escape. Walter was 73 now, slowing down in ways that suggested his body was tired even if his purpose was renewed, spending less time at the office and more time at the foundation, meeting families and hearing stories, and being present in ways he'd never made time for when he was building his fortune. India ran the foundation with the competence Walter had recognized in her that first day, had grown it from idea to institution, had built systems that would outlast both of them, had trained staff who understood that dignity mattered more than efficiency, and that listening to people's stories was part of the help, not separate from it. They had weekly dinners, Walter and India, genuine friendship built over 5 years of shared work and shared values, crossing boundaries of race and class and age that usually kept people in separate worlds. "That $5 tip was the best investment I ever made," Walter said one evening over dinner, reflecting on how a test designed to confirm cynicism had become the catalyst for transformation he couldn't have predicted. India smiled. "It wasn't the tip," she corrected gently. "It was what came after." "What came after?" Walter asked. "You chose to listen instead of judge," India said. "When I challenged you about testing people through cruelty, you could have dismissed me or defended yourself or walked away. Instead, you listened. You let yourself be taught by a waitress you'd been testing. That's rarer than money. That's the investment that mattered." Walter died at 74, peaceful in his sleep, his will revealing that the foundation would receive $7 billion, enough to continue the work for generations, enough to help hundreds of thousands of families over decades, enough to prove that wealth's purpose was multiplication of human dignity, not accumulation of zeros in bank accounts. India continued his work, suggested the foundation be renamed the Margaret and Walter Green Foundation, because both of them deserved to be remembered in something that embodied their values, Walter's late-life wisdom and Margaret's lifetime of service, combining into legacy that would outlast them both. India's philosophy became the foundation's official motto, printed on letterhead and website and every piece of literature they produced. Everyone's fighting battles you can't see. Choose grace. Simple words carrying the wisdom that had transformed a billionaire's grief into purpose and a waitress's gratitude into institution, reminding everyone who worked there and everyone they helped that kindness was choice, not requirement, and that grace given freely multiplied in ways that calculations could never predict. A man walked into my diner and left a $5 tip to test my character, India reflected years later when asked to speak about the foundation's origins. He wanted to see if I'd be grateful or greedy, if I'd accept less than I deserved with grace or complaint. I said, "Thank you because that's who I am, who I decided to be, after my husband died, and bitterness was easier but more expensive than grace. Not because I knew Walter was rich, not because I was naive about the insult, but because I'd learned that you can't control what people give you, only how you receive it, and I chose to receive everything with gratitude because the alternative was becoming bitter, and bitterness was killing me faster than poverty." He thought he was testing me, India continued, but really I was teaching him. Teaching that money doesn't measure worth, that kindness isn't about what you receive but about what you choose to be, regardless of circumstance, that testing people's character through cruelty reveals the tester, not the tested. He changed my life by funding a foundation that's helped 50,000 families. I changed his by reminding him why any of it mattered, why wealth without purpose is just numbers that don't add up to meaning, why Margaret would have wanted him to use their fortune to multiply dignity instead of hoarding it until death made the decision for him. Walter Green spent 11 months leaving $5 tips on $70 bills at diners across Massachusetts, testing waitresses to see if anyone could be grateful for less than they deserved, looking for someone worthy of his $9.4 billion fortune because his wife had died and he had no children, and he'd become so bitter. He believed everyone was corrupted by money and only cruelty could reveal true character. The disappointing people deliberately would show him who remained kind when kindness wasn't rewarded. And India Foster, a 46-year-old black widow working double shifts to help her daughter through college, picked up that insulting tip and said, "This is enough. Thank you for seeing me." Because she'd learned years earlier when her husband died, and survival meant working 3 jobs for tips that barely covered rent, that you can't control what people give you, only how you receive it, that everyone's fighting battles you can't see, and that choosing grace costs nothing but means everything, that kindness was decision she made every single day, regardless of whether customers were generous or cruel, or saw her as human or as furniture that brought coffee. She didn't know he was a billionaire testing her, didn't know that 7 words would completely rewrite his will and create a foundation that would help 50,000 families over the next decade, that would pay off $500 million in medical debt and fund thousands of college scholarships and give struggling families the same chance she'd wished someone had given her when her husband died. Just knew that kindness was a choice she made, regardless of circumstance, that grace was muscle she'd been strengthening for 6 years of survival, that treating people with dignity cost nothing and sometimes meant everything. And that single moment of choosing gratitude over resentment, grace over bitterness, humanity over